Tinc el gust de presentar avui, en aquest sentit agraeixo als organitzadors la invitació. M'agrada molt ser amb vosaltres, especialment a un país tan estimat per mi com és Irlanda. La sessió és Irlanda, la caiguda i la recuperació del Tigre Celta. Només 2 apunts m'agradaria fer sobre aquest tema perquè els autèntics especialistes en aquestes qüestions els tinc aquí al costat i ara els presentaré, però d'entrada m'agradaria dir que el títol, comentar que el títol potser sembla implicar una recuperació imminent i potser és una mica prematur parlar d'una recuperació imminent i potser és una miqueta optimista, d'això en parlarem. De totes maneres, m'agradaria emfatitzar que l'economia irlandesa, a diferència de la grega, té una salut en molts aspectes extraordinària. Per exemple, la presidenta McAleese ens recordava aquí a Barcelona fa poques setmanes que exporta béns i serveis financers arreu i que concretament parlava ella que és el principal, ens recordava que és el principal exportador de productes farmacèutics del món. És el segon exportador en serveis informàtics, darrere de l'Índia, però davant d'Alemanya, del Regne Unit i dels Estats Units. Per tant, estem parlant econòmicament d'un país de grans èxits, tenint en compte que es tracta d'un país petit. Aleshores, d'aquestes qüestions en parlarem, però també, òbviament, de problemes. Els problemes bàsics que han comportat un rescat en aquests últims mesos són una fallida bancària, concretament el cas del banc anglo-irish, és el cas més extrem de fallida, i també una situació de grans dèficits pressupostaris, com és el cas de Grècia, Portugal, Espanya. El govern ha gastat més del que rebia en taxes i, per tant, s'ha endeutat d'una manera molt important. Per tant, com Irlanda farà front a aquesta doble crisi i alhora pagarà el crèdit al Banc Central Europeu i al Fons Monetari és el que parlarem avui aquest matí en aquesta sessió. M'agradaria per això acabar la meva petita introducció dient que amb una nota molt positiva, i és que en aquests últims dies ha tingut Irlanda la visita de la reina britànica, que ha passat per primera vegada i que té una importància simbòlica gran, i també del president Obama. Totes dues visites donen un reforç a la imatge exterior del país i a, per tant, la indústria turística, que és important. Em referiré al cas del discurs del president Obama, que si recomano que l'escolteu, si no ho heu fet, també m'ha agradat molt, com és un gran orador, certament, i ell feia referència a la relació, a la força, a la il·lusió que tenen els immigrants. Irlanda, com sabeu, és un país de migrants, de gent, hi ha molts més irlandesos a fora que a dintre. En el cas dels Estats Units, el president Obama recordava que mai un país petit ha causat una influència tan gran en un país gran com és els Estats Units. I ell es referia a aquesta il·lusió i aquesta força dels emigrants, de la gent que emigra i intenta formar famílies, feina, empreses a altres països, aquesta força, aquesta il·lusió per enfrontar-nos al futur. I parlava, crec que referia a un poeta, crec que devia ser Yeats, que deia que la nostra responsabilitat comença en els nostres somnis. Doncs m'acullo a les paraules d'Obama i com una oració, aquesta frase que ens ha il·luminat en aquests darrers temps, sí que podem enfrontar-nos a les crisis, les petites nacions, i amb aquesta voluntat constructiva i optimista crec que és com ho podem fer. Avui tenim l'oportunitat de discutir, de parlar sobre com podem enfrontar-nos i concretament escoltar l'experiència irlandesa. Per començar us presentaré un polític veterà, el senyor Dick Roche. Welcome to Barcelona, to Catalonia, Mr. Roche. Thanks for being here and sharing your experience with us. El senyor Roche ha estat ministre per Afers Europeus de l'any 2 a l'any 11. Ha estat l'europeu, la persona europea que ha ocupat aquest càrrec durant més temps. Va representar la Unió Europea durant l'aclamada presidència irlandesa a Europa També ha ocupat altres carteres com la de Medi Ambient. Ell ha estat professor en Afers Europeus a la University College Dublin. Des del 87 ha estat parlamentari i, entre altres tasques, que són molt llargues i no m'extendré, ha coordinat la incorporació de 10 països, els 10 països a la Unió Europea que es van incorporar el 2004. Ha treballat per la millora també de la comunicació entre les institucions europees i la ciutadania. Doncs, senyor Roche, li donem una mitja hora perquè ens exposi quines són les vies per les que ha de passar la política irlandesa per sortir d'aquesta crisi en els pròxims anys.
I wish I had the answer, but I do have an analysis of the problem. In December 2006, when I said I wish I had the answers. In December 2006, when Brian Cowan, who was then Minister for Finance, stood up in the Dáil to speak about his budget for 2007, he opened by saying that he was delighted to report that Ireland's economy is strong. Growth is running at 5%, which is a sustainable level, and more than 2 million people were at work. 12 months later, on the 5th of December 2007, outlining his 2008 budget, he spoke of a global economy beset with uncertainties. Nonetheless, he suggested that the fundamentals of the Irish economy were strong, as they still are, but that there were some underlying problems. Greenspan described the events around the collapse of Lehman Brothers and that preceded that as the once-in-a-century event. It was certainly the perfect storm. And a country like Ireland was hit by this perfect storm. I think you have to put Ireland's case in context. Ireland is a small open economy. We are more dependent on exports than any other country in the world. I think the only country that is more open in terms of its economic realities is Singapore. We were squeezed by the global credit squeeze. We were very badly hit by the slump. And as a small open economy, in 2008 and 2009, if you look at the Irish statistics, they began to disimprove dramatically and very rapidly. Unemployment grew at a frighteningly high rate in the private sector. The economic activity was down right across the sectors, but in particular in one sector, building and construction industry, which had had a massive bubble. To add to the other woes, and this collapse of the building and construction industry added very significantly to the other woes of government. Because by 2008, 2007, 2008, the building and construction industry, house building, commercial building, was bringing in such a vast amount of tax to the Irish exchequer that we were somewhat awash with tax. Indeed, I was just saying in 2006, September 2006, a colleague of mine in the Irish cabinet made a very stupid speech in which he said that the Irish exchequer had too much tax. We didn't need as much money as we had, and he particularly attacked our system of property tax, our stamp duties. That actually led to a curtailment of demand in the building and construction industry. And I actually I've suggested at home that that was the very day that the beginning of the end of the building boom in Ireland started. However, there was reason to hope, even as we got into 2008, there was reason to hope that Ireland could weather the economic storm. Tough action was being taken, and there was public support for the action, which was quite surprising. There was a problem, however, that we weren't aware of in December 2008, December 2007, as we were going into the economic year 2008. There was a ticking time bomb in the Irish economy, in the Irish banking sector, and that time bomb was about to explode with catastrophic circumstances. We could possibly have dealt with the economic downturn, but to deal with the implosion of the banking sector at the same time was very difficult. On the 29th of September 2008, Irish people woke up to the news that something very startling had happened overnight. What had happened overnight is that the government had decided, we had decided, that we had no option but to step in and to guarantee the Irish banking system. People have asked why. We were very conscious politically of what had just happened in the United Kingdom, where Northern Rock had gone to the wall. and where thousands of people had queued for days to try and withdraw their life savings. And we knew that the situation in the Irish banking sector was so bad that if one bank was allowed to go under, it would have dragged down all of the other banks. In fact, on the 28th of September, the most senior personnel from the two longest-standing Irish banks, Allied Irish Banks and the Bank of Ireland, went to the Ministry for Finance, and they warned that the following day the entire banking system would collapse. They were particularly worried about a bank called Anglo-Irish Bank. Anglo-Irish Bank was the equivalent of a black hole, not just in the Irish economy, but a black hole in the whole banking system of Europe. And I'll come to some of the reasons why later on. Anglo, it was felt, would collapse. Anglo didn't have a chance of surviving. On that day, the 28th of September, the Irish Stock Exchange had the biggest one-day fall in history. 6.5 billion was wiped off Irish stocks. 13% was the decline by the end of the day in the market. There was panic in the market, and it was very obvious that the next day, the 29th of September, that something horrific was going to happen. So overnight, in the early hours of the morning of the 29th of September, a cabinet decision was made to guarantee the banking system. It has to be said that the decision was made against imperfect information. But under the new scheme, or scheme that was introduced that day, the state would guarantee all loans and deposits in the country's banks and in building societies. Measures to prevent abuses of the scheme were introduced. The scheme would not be cost-free. The banks would have to pay, and in fact the banks have paid about 1.3 billion since the scheme was introduced. Regulations taking the government deep into the banking system were forecast. Each bank was to take what was called public interest or public representatives onto the board. In addition to guaranteeing the banking sector, there was another problem that faced the Irish government, that the banking system itself, although the guarantee prevented a run on the banks, the guarantee prevented frightened depositors or business simply withdrawing their funds. There was a huge overhang that existed in the banks because of profligate lending that they had operated. So a new agency called the National Assets Management Agency was established. The National Assets Management Agency would take the impaired assets off the accounts, off the books of the banks, take them into its ownership, would establish a valuation on those assets. It wouldn't be the market valuation, because many of the assets had a nil market valuation, but it would be a valuation based on what price would likely to be yielded ultimately from the assets. The arrangements were that over a period of time, the agency would reconstruct some of the assets, would sell them on, and if there was a deficiency at the end, a banking levy would make up that deficiency. At this stage in Ireland, there was considerable political support for what the government was doing. The main opposition party, Fine Gael, which is now the lead party of government, they actually voted for the guarantee scheme. Indeed, most members of Dáil Éireann in the lower house voted for it, and there wasn't even a vote in the upper house. The support was so strong. One party, the Labour Party, which is now in government, it did advocate a different course of action, and many of its people were saying that the banks should not be bailed out, that the banks should be burned, and that the bondholders in particular who had made assets available to the banks should face a default. In addition to the banking measures in 2008 and 2009 and onwards, a series of austerity measures were introduced in Ireland. In October 2008, a budget for 2009 was introduced. That was very unusual because the budgetary cycle in Ireland is the calendar year, so the budget for the next year is always taken in the December of the preceding year. And an additional supplementary budget was introduced in April 2009. So we had two budgets within a period of 5 months. Over a 2.5-year period, following the banking collapse, there were very stringent measures taken in Ireland. 15 billion in cuts were taken out of public expenditure, which in our context is a very, very big figure. A further 6 billion in adjustments were provided for in the two budgets for 2011. And the government's aim was that by December 2011, we'd be 2/3 of the way to meeting the deficit, the 3% deficit target by 2014. There was a blip in this, of course, because when you took into account the bailout for the banks, the national debt took a huge one-off jump. There was international support, it has to be said, for the measures that the Irish government was introducing. The Sunday Telegraph, a paper which is not normally a big fan of Ireland, praised the government, said that the Irish Minister for Finance was treating the voters as grown-ups. I'm not sure that the voters actually all agreed with that, but that's the case. The New York Times reported analysts had taken a positive view of the budget, and an economic editor in the BBC said in a programme famously in Ireland that the British government should take a lesson or two from the Irish government's approach. Also in 2010, a national recovery plan for the years 2011 to 2014 was published. The plan sets out a blueprint for a return to sustainable growth in the Irish economy, and in particular the plan sets out measures that were necessary to restore Ireland's public finances to stability. The Commission, the EU Commission, endorsed the plan, and ECOFIN in particular welcomed and expressed confidence in the four-year development plan. And so there seemed to be a general support for it. Ominously, however, in October of last year, that ECOFIN meeting, there was an interesting phrase in its comment in its communique. It said, and I quote, "Market conditions have not normalised and pressure remains, giving rise to concerns for further reforms and stabilisation measures may be appropriate." What that was saying, of course, was that there was going to be an intervention by the IMF and the EU in Ireland. There are two questions which arise, I think, from the Irish case. The first case is what actually brought about the IMF-EU intervention, and secondly, why in the first case did the banking system go so wrong? It's easier to answer the second question first. As we moved to 2010, the narrative on Ireland changed, and changed very dramatically. Confidence, particularly in the international, particularly amongst the rating agencies, that we were going to be able to weather the storm in the banking system, it withered away. If you actually look at some of the comments at that time, there was literally an acceptance that there was a black hole in the Irish economy. People didn't know where the bottom line, where the banking was. Although we believed that we could perhaps deal with it, we did have a problem that every time there were new statistics published about the Irish banking sector, they were even worse than the previous statistics. There was another thing that happened as well, of course, in 2009, 2010. Bankers who in the preceding decade had been willing to fund any harebrained scheme at all were now not willing to fund even the most basic and well-based business decisions. I should say there was mounting political fury in Ireland too. There's a lot more calls at this time for default. There was a belief that the bondholders should be burned, that there was no moral hazard in the banking system, and that we, the taxpayers, were taking the hit. By November 2010, the narrative of Ireland had moved to the position that our sovereign position was back, was now seen as the problem. Was Ireland going to be able to deal with the position? Just to remind you of one statistic, on the 11th of November, the premium demanded by the market for 10-year Irish bonds rose to a record 652 points over the German rate, which again was an astonishing decline in confidence. The debate, of course, refocused on the banking and the difficulties, and the very high price ticket for credit in Ireland. The increase in Ireland's bond spreads became an ever-increasing concern. The Irish government were not anxious, it should be said, to invite the IMF or the ECB in. We took the view that the fundamentals in the Irish economy were strong. We were fully funded until the middle of 2011. We had a cash balance of 22 billion in the National Treasury Management Agency, an agency that was created during the good years when we had too much tax and we had to put it somewhere. A further 25 billion existed in the National Pension Reserve Fund. The public finance adjustments were on track, and in fact it's very interesting. Ireland's deficit for 2010 at 11.9% of GDP was broadly in line with the budget predictions of the preceding year. The exchequer returns for October of last year were actually very good. They were 1% ahead of schedule. Again, indicating the point that President McAleese made here. Export-led growth had restarted. There was an additional 6 billion in adjustments in a budget that we were introducing for the current year, for 2011. So we felt that by the end of this year, we would have made very significant progress. We wouldn't be out of the woods, but we would be out of the deepest part of the woods. The fact that this was not cutting any ice, however, became obvious in October and November. Communique issued at the end of the November ECOFIN meeting concluded with a welcome, and I quote, that welcoming the determination of the Irish Government to engage in short and focused consultation with the Commission, the ECB and the IMF in order to determine the best way to provide any necessary support to address market risks. Politically, we were in a very difficult position at this time because we hadn't committed to accepting an IMF bailout, IMF EU bailout. We did not want to go down that particular course, take that course of action. We still believed that it would be possible to steer our way through the storm. This led to a situation where ministers, myself included, had to go on television, both in Ireland and abroad, and say that we weren't in negotiations. That led to public fury when it turned out that the IMF, when the IMF arrived in Dublin. So within days of the November ECOFIN, the IMF were in Dublin. The faith of the Irish government was sealed, and the once vaunted Celtic tiger economy had turned into the delinquent of Europe. It should also be said that we faced economic and we faced political meltdown, those of us who were in government. So there was, in that period from 2008 to 2011, there was an understandable decline in the confidence internationally, the capacity to carry this double burden. The bigger question, though, is what happened in the Irish banking sector? How, in the name of goodness, could a single bank with a single office in Dublin not just undermine the Irish economy, but how could it actually put in danger the entire Eurozone? And I think there's some salutary lessons to be learned from this. There have been three very objective analyses, although politically it's not accepted that the university they were objective, but there are certainly analyses that are worthy that have credibility into the Irish banking system. One of them was by Professor Honohan, who is now the governor of the central bank. Second was by Regling and Watson. Regling, of course, both were well known for their work in the IMF, and the third was by Neuberger, who was involved in the Finnish difficulties. The main findings of about banking practice in Ireland make salutary reading. I'm just summarising them. It's found that directors of Irish banks were guilty of comprehensive failure to maintain safe and sound banking practices. Banks borrowed too much abroad to support a credit-fueled property market and construction frenzy. I was just saying, in fact, I had an extraordinary experience in my own household. When my young daughter, 2 years graduated out of medical college, walked into a bank without an appointment to find out if she could get a mortgage. The bank was RBS. They'd only recently opened. They were involved in very predatory banking practices. And when she came out of the bank manager had offered this 27-year-old a €650,000 mortgage for a property that still hadn't been built in the centre of Dublin. It was barely, it looked like a joke to me, as a bad joke. It looked even worse when my daughter and her brother went on and took the mortgage up, but however. The bank governance and risk management was weak, in fact disastrously so, right across the sector. The main finding was that the central bank and regulatory bankings, that the banking regulator both failed in their tasks. The approach taken by the central bank and the regulator was timid, excessively deferential and accommodating. In fact, the central bank and our regulators seemed to be terrified to upset the bankers. Regulators didn't move decisively or quickly enough. There's too much emphasis being put on not upsetting the competitive position of the Irish banks. Banks like RBS had come in. They had their own policies. Irish banks were now trying to trump those policies. The central bank and the regulator were unwilling to face the real risk of a looming bank problem, and they put it off. There were also, Regling and Watson found there were also, of course, factors outside Ireland. Financial integration in the European area, as it deepened, it meant that there was unprecedented access to cross-border funding into Ireland. That this access to external funding meant that Ireland's boom could continue for longer and that the asset bubble became ever bigger. I'll give you an example. We have 4.2 million people in Ireland. In the year 2006-2007, we built over 90,000 new homes. I remember saying at the time to a member of the Building and Construction Industry Federation, was it their plan that every child would be given a key to a new house the moment they were born? It didn't make sense. The entry of foreign banks certainly intensified competition. More recently, there has been a very interesting report by Neuberg, which in fact reappraises these. The position in Ireland, there were other issues as well. Again, Honohan and Regling and Watson referred to government expenditure in Ireland. Government expenditure in Ireland increased very dramatically during the period of the Celtic Tiger. We introduced social policies and social supports which we couldn't previously afford. Huge amounts of money were spent on infrastructure. All of government expenditure policies were pro-cyclical. It would have been better if they were contra-cyclical. Easy to say that now. Of course, at the time, the general advocacy in the Irish economy is that government should spend more, not less. In fact, famously, the Minister, Brian Cowan, who's referred to by the current Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, as Ebenezer Scrooge. This is in the budget before the collapse. On the taxation policies, Honohan and Regling and Watson report issues about taxes, particularly taxes in the property sector. The taxes only, in fact, over the years, from the late 1980s, from the 1980s onward, Ireland had become a low-tax economy. We continuously cut taxation to encourage to incentivise investment and to incentivise. Actually, the view generally taken that the people would be spending their money more efficiently than the government. There had been in 2006 a realisation that we needed to start countering these policies, and in fact a whole series of building incentives or construction incentives were removed in the budget, but it was probably too little, too late. Modest changes in the property tax area made by government were actually criticised at the time, and more tax concessions were being advocated. There were political charges too that had been made about the banking sector in Ireland. It was felt that there was too much, that the people in the banking sector were too close to political power. Regling and Watson and Honohan actually look at this, and they make a very interesting point. They pointed out that there was, in fact, no evidence that this was a major factor. But what was a factor was the deficiencies in the regulatory and the control systems. As I said, if you actually look at the entire experience, the operations of one bank, Anglo Bank, was so extraordinary that this tiny bank had become of systemic importance within the Irish system. Had it collapsed, it would have brought the entire banking system down with it. It had interrelationships into other financial institutions, which are currently the subject of criminal investigations. In fact, files have been sent to our Director of Public Prosecutions. Basically, Neuberg makes the point in his report that what really had happened was that the banking was that we had misjudged risk. That risk had been misjudged right across the whole system. He found that there's a whole series of major flaws in the control systems. They applied right throughout Irish banking, and by definition, they applied across Europe. There was unhindered expansion of credit, the cross-border credit that came in. The speed and the severity of the crisis, he said, made it worse, but the fundamental, we would be facing an implosion in any event. Safeguards that were needed were ineffective and systematically ineffective, and bank management, he said, was dire. So where does this leave us in Ireland? It leaves us, of course, with a very significant challenge. This year, the Irish voters visited upon my party and the parties in government the most extraordinary decision, most extraordinarily harsh judgment. My own party, for example, we were not only thrown out of government, but we achieved the lowest vote since 1926. In fact, we were decimated, or close enough to decimated. 3/4 of the deputies lost their positions. There are lessons here. I think there are lessons here for the whole of Europe. I think first and foremost there are fundamental problems in the way that we regulate banks right across the whole European Union. Secondly, I think that there has been right across the Union again excessive deference. I personally take the view that we will probably weather the storm, but that we do need to learn the lessons from it. Certainly, there is no doubt in my mind that when Mrs. Merkel a little while back spoke about introducing moral hazard into the banking community, she was right. One of the big difficulties which we had politically in Ireland was the demands from the taxpayers that there should be default. The taxpayers were actually asking the question, why should they be bearing the consequences of profligate banking when the bankers were walking free all across Europe? The narrative changes from country to country. I was in the last public engagement I gave before the election was to speak to the French Senate and French Assembly committees, and in both cases they were under the impression that they were bailing Ireland out, not being fully aware of the extent to which we will have to pay for the bailout and how difficult that will be over the next decade. Of course, they were also ignoring the fact that the bankers who were profligate in the lending were at least as responsible as the bankers who were as profligate in the Irish case. There is a fundamental need, in my view, there's a fundamental discussion that we're going to have about banking in Europe. I think that some good will come out of the out of the collapse. I think the point can't be ignored, however, that the euro system has within it some fairly fundamental flaws. It has been built on the most optimistic of assumptions, the assumptions that you wouldn't have a meltdown in Ireland or Portugal or Greece or wherever. I think those assumptions now have to be revisited. So by way of a final footnote, I'll finish with this. As I said, there's been a demand in Ireland for retribution against the banking system. It's interesting now, we're in the middle of 2011. The basic facts about Anglo Bank became public knowledge in the autumn of 2008, and there still hasn't been criminal charges levelled against anybody. As a constituent of mine recently said, if a child from an underprivileged background wandered into one of the banks, put his hand through the counter and stole a €100 note, it would take about 3 months to bring him to court, and he would be in jail. It seems strange that the bankers didn't face any similar retribution. I'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you very much.